And now we're joined in the studio by RT Africa Bureau Chief and African Legacy Forum Coordinator, Moussa Ibrahim. Welcome. Very nice to see you.
Welcome, Fiorella.
So are the events in Niger, and I think this is the biggest question, part of a growing trend? This isn't the first time we saw Burkina Faso, we saw Mali. Is this a trend in opposing the neocolonialism of Europe and the West?
Well, on the surface, as the Western media narrative would like us to believe, it is just another mundane coup d'etat in the Black continent. Niger herself had her fair share of coup d'etats, from the first one in 1974, the year I was born, and then in 1996, 1999, 2010, and now 2023. But this is a very fake, falsified, superficial look at what is happening now. The new generations of African politicians, the population in general, are now reviving the discourse of African liberation that was silenced for decades by the dominance of Western culture and Western media in the region. That's why the West never stood against the previous coup d'etats in Niger. In fact, they supported some of these military coups. But why are they now so adamant and vigorous about opposing this specific military movement, to the extent that they are proposing possible military intervention? Another disastrous one, like the one that took place in Libya in 2011, that tells us the story is different. The story is that there is a culture of resistance, of liberation in the west of Africa. People know that the superficial demands for democracy are not enough to just go to the polls and cast your vote, as the West would like people to do. What people want is to gain back their wealth, back their uranium, their gold, their iron, their phosphate, their oil, their gas. And this scares the West, because this means the true democracy will take place in Africa when people actually own their own land, and the wealth of Africa does not go untaxed, unsupervised from the mines in Niger to the banks of Paris and the financial sector in Britain. So what is happening now? It looks on the surface as if it's another coup d'etat, but it comes within the context of the new revived Pan-Africanism. We saw the support that Niger got from Burkina Faso and Mali. And by the way, the support with the general population, away from the governments, which are puppets of the West, is much deeper and much stronger. You could see it on social media. People are not opposing the change in Niger because they knew that the previous president of Niger, whom I knew personally and I visited and sat with and talked to, he was just executing what the West always wanted for Niger, to stay a very poor, impoverished country, providing very precious raw materials for the West. And then the West would say, oh, look, we are giving aid to the Niger. We are helping Niger to have democracy, which is very, very false, falsified democracy. It just means that part of the population, maybe 15%, 20%, they go to the polls once every 4 or 6 years. People in the West don't believe in this democracy. We see people in the States, Britain, Germany, and France fed up with this form of fake democracy in which the few own most of the wealth of the country. Well, in Africa, not even the few, it's the foreigner who owns the wealth of the country.
Well, yeah, you bring up good points, because Africa, the continent, is full of resource-rich nations that don't see any of that wealth. Now, we heard this similar sentiment, this sort of echoing of Thomas Sankara and Muammar Gaddafi at the Russia-Africa summit. And most recently, of course, we hear this solidarity with the coup in Niger. Mali and Burkina Faso, as you mentioned, say that they consider an attack on Niger an attack on them. Now, they also cited concerns of Niger becoming like Libya. Can you outline what that scenario would look like?
Well, I would encourage your viewers to just go back to 2011 and listen to the two dominant discourses at that time. There is the West's discourse, which said, oh, we are bringing democracy to Libya. We are protecting civilians. We are rebuilding it as a modern country for human rights. We are situating it in the international community to be a safe place for Libyans and Africans and for the Mediterranean bases. We are bringing prosperity to the country. And then the Gaddafi Pan-Africanist discourse, which said, no, what will happen is total destruction of Libya, robbing of Libya's oil, the terrorist organizations dominating the country, continuation of civil and tribal conflict. Libya will become a center of instability and danger for the whole of the Sahara and Sahel region and the continent. 12 years after these discourses were put forward, which discourse proved beyond any reasonable doubt to be the accurate discourse is the discourse of Gaddafi, of the Pan-Africanists who knew that what Gaddafi meant to the West is a challenge to the dominance of the West, is actually a call for Africans to gain back their true independence. In the 50s and 60s, Africans, after great struggle, they gained nominal political independence. But now, decades later, they realize what they truly need is the economic independence. And as a matter of fact, the great leaders of Africa, from Nasser to Gaddafi to Lumumba to Nkrumah to Mandela to Nyerere, all of them understood this. And you can see it and read it in their speeches. But the time was not ripe for them to move forward with the economic liberation. I think now, starting from West Africa, the time is ripe for Africans to regain their uranium, their gold, which, for example, in Ghana, their oil and gas, and they should build their African Central Bank, African unified currency, and then Africa will be truly liberated, and a liberated continent can have democracy, human rights, gender rights, ethnic rights, religious rights. But an enslaved continent cannot have these rights. It will be just lip service, superficial democratic system serving the West.
Well, we do recall the 2011 U.S.-backed coup of Muammar Gaddafi under Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and the Obama administration. Now, you experienced this firsthand. Could you tell us a little bit about what you saw and how that affected the people of the country, obviously beyond what we know as the slave trade and everything that went down?
Well, what I witnessed is this working together of the different institutions of the West, what we call the West. So the governments and the main media, mainstream media in the West, intellectuals, universities, civil society, they all came together to present one false narrative to the world, so they would justify the destruction of Libya. Why? Because all of this diversity, apparent diversity of the West, actually comes into one place. They all cannot live or survive one day without the wealth of Africa, whether they are intellectuals in a British university or journalists working for a French media outlet, or whether they are generals in a Spanish army or politicians in Belgium. They all know deep down that they cannot have a Pan-Africanist project, which Gaddafi famously was leading. He was calling for the establishment of the unified African army, the Central African Bank, the one African currency. And he was building up his gold reserve in Libya with the help of other African countries to support these projects. The Europeans talked to him and threatened him not to do it. He refused, he did not back down, and the result, they attacked Libya under false flag operation, the colored revolution of the Middle East. And now what do we have? Do we have democratic Libya? Do we have prosperous Libya? Libya is one of the main sources of terrorism, of weaponry, of instability in the whole of the continent, and actually a source of terror even for Europe because of the what they call illegal immigration for Africans through Libya to Europe, and the slave trade, which was flourishing in Libya for years. Now it's a little bit better, the situation. ISIS regarded Libya for years after Gaddafi as its main base around the world. So I think your viewers should really watch reality, not just listen to the discourse, not to my discourse, not to the West scores. See what happens in real life. Who owns the money? Who owns the mines of Africa? Who owns the assets of Africa? And these people have no right. Only Africans, the African population should own its own wealth, unite, and then you can talk about civil society and rights and democracy, because these things happen naturally as you advance and liberate yourself economically. But if you pay attention to these rights without economic liberation of the continent, you will never achieve these rights and you will never achieve economic liberation.
And Western involvement in Africa goes back centuries. Now, we did see Mali and Burkina Faso oust the French out of their countries. Do you think that this is also related to multipolarity, the emerging Pan-Africanism, as you mentioned? We've also seen some of that Pan-Arabism, and we're seeing the entire global South,
Absolutely.
Whether it's India and Latin America as well. Do you see this conflict perhaps being the spark to start more similar actions, not just in Africa, but perhaps beyond?
Absolutely. There is a new map of the world being drawn. We live through one of the most important historical moments ever. We are lucky and honored to witness this. There is a true revolution in Africa, but it's combined by a genuine radical change worldwide. Now, as an African myself, I would like Africa to be a force for good, a force for peace. But sometimes when you are enslaved, you have to fight back. And then you know, the ugly thing takes place, wars and conflicts and armed resistance. But we only achieved our independence and nominal liberation in the 50s and 60s through sacrifice and blood. We fought in Algeria, in Libya, in Egypt, in South Africa, in Tanzania, in Mozambique, everywhere. And we have the blood of our martyrs shed everywhere, in every corner of the continent. I think the rising economies and powers of China, of Russia, of India, of Brazil, Latin America, of Nigeria in Africa, of South Africa, the change in direction of Saudi Arabia and Iran and all of these countries, I think will help to establish a new world in which not one side is completely 100% dominant. This will allow the game to be fair. It will not be perfect, but it will allow Africa, Latin America, South Asia to have a maneuvering space, to be able to protect itself by using different sources of defense. And I really, from my heart, hope that this will be done peacefully without the need for more wars. But unfortunately, the global system of capitalism that lives on the blood and wealth of other regions in the world will not accept this, will not accept any change of the map of the world, and it will send its armies into the depth of Africa like it did before, the depth of Asia like it did before, and the depth of Latin America. So war is upon the West, not upon Russia or China or the global South. And once we establish this culture of resistance, I'm hoping that the West will come to its senses and realizes that maybe it should find a way to coexist with the rest of the world instead of going full Monty and just destroying everything and everyone with it coming down. Well,
you said it, coexist, mutual respect, and national sovereignty. Those are key words right there.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. That's RT Africa Bureau Chief and African Legacy Forum Coordinator, Moussa Ibrahim. Thank you very much.